In 1973, Norton unveiled a motorcycle so revolutionary that the racing world didn't know what to do with it. The NRS 588 wasn't just fast, it was different. Fundamentally, radically different. It used a Wankel Rotary engine, a power plant so alien to traditional motorcycle design that when it started winning races, the sport's governing bodies faced an impossible question. How do you regulate something you don't understand? Within months of its debut, the bike was effectively banned from Grand Prix competition, not because it broke the rules, but because nobody could agree on what the rules even meant anymore. This is the story of Norton's rotary dream and the technology that was too strange to survive. Along the way, we'll encounter engineering genius, political maneuvering, racing glory, and one of the most controversial decisions in motorcycle racing history. So, let's begin. But first, what exactly is a Wankel engine, and why did Norton think it could change everything? Now, the internal combustion engine has worked pretty much the same way since the 1800s. Pistons go up and down, crankshafts spin, valves open and close. It's elegant in its way, but it's also complicated. Lots of moving parts, lots of things that can break, lots of weight. In 1929, a German engineer named Felix Wankel started wondering if there was a better way. What if, instead of pistons pumping up and down, you had a rotor that just spun? One continuous motion instead of thousands of tiny explosions fighting against each other? It took him nearly 30 years to figure it out. But by 1957, Wankel had a working prototype. The design was beautifully simple. A triangular rotor spins inside an epitrochoidal housing, basically a figure-8 shape. As the rotor turns, it creates 3 separate chambers that expand and contract, handling intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust in one smooth rotation. No valves, no camshafts. Far fewer moving parts than a traditional engine. The advantages were obvious. Rotary engines were compact, lightweight, and incredibly smooth. They could rev to the moon without shaking themselves apart. For the same displacement, they produced significantly more power than piston engines, and they were mechanically simpler, which theoretically meant more reliability. Car manufacturers went crazy for it. Mazda licensed the technology and eventually built entire sports cars around it. NSU in Germany put rotaries in production vehicles. For a moment in the 1960s, it looked like the Wankel might actually replace the piston engine entirely. But there were problems. Rotary engines were thirsty, fuel economy was terrible. The apex seals where the rotor tips contacted the housing wore out quickly and were expensive to replace. Emissions were harder to control. And perhaps most importantly, mechanics didn't know how to work on them. The whole automotive infrastructure was built around piston engines. I mention this because understanding the rotary's dual nature, genuinely revolutionary but practically problematic, is essential to understanding what happened at Norton. They weren't just building a motorcycle, they were betting the company on a technology the rest of the world was already starting to abandon. Norton Motorcycles, by the early 1970s, was a company desperately searching for a future. The British motorcycle industry was collapsing around them. Japanese manufacturers were eating their lunch with better, cheaper, more reliable bikes. Norton had heritage. The Manx Norton was legendary. But heritage doesn't pay the bills. They needed something to set themselves apart. The Rotary project started in 1969 when Norton's parent company, Norton Villiers, acquired the rights to a BSA-developed Wankel engine design. BSA had been experimenting with rotaries but never brought anything to market. Norton saw potential where others saw a dead end. The first Norton rotary prototype appeared in 1973. It was called the Classic, though there was nothing classic about it. Twin rotor design, liquid-cooled, producing around 80 horsepower. For context, that was competitive with the best Japanese 4-cylinder machines of the era, but from an engine roughly the size of a shoebox. The power-to-weight ratio was exceptional. But here's the thing about rotary engines in motorcycles. They have characteristics that are, depending on your perspective, either perfect or terrible for two-wheeled applications. The gyroscopic forces from the spinning rotor affect handling in ways that piston engines don't. The power delivery is linear and smooth, which sounds good until you realize that some riders actually want that explosive mid-range punch from a traditional engine, and the heat management on a motorcycle, where you can't hide a big radiator behind a car's grill, was genuinely challenging. Norton persisted anyway. They saw racing as the proving ground. The company had always been racing people. The Manx Norton won countless Isle of Man TTs. Racing was in their blood. And the Rotary, whatever its quirks, had one undeniable advantage. It made power. Lots of it. Smoothly, reliably, and in a package much lighter than the competition. The racing rotary project evolved throughout the late 1970s. Norton refined the design, solved cooling problems, improved the apex seals. By the early 1980s, they had something genuinely competitive. And in 1987, they created the race bike that would change everything and ultimately destroy their racing ambitions. The Norton RCW588 was a twin-rotor machine producing around 140 horsepower. Now, I want you to think about that number for a second. 140 horsepower from an engine with no pistons, no valves, no traditional reciprocating mass at all. The engine could rev past 11,000 RPM without drama. It was smooth enough that riders reported feeling like they were riding a turbine rather than a motorcycle. The chassis was developed with help from Spondon Engineering, who built some of the finest racing frames in Britain. The whole package weighed around 130 kilograms dry. This was a proper Grand Prix contender, and they proved it. In 1992, Norton entered the British Superbike Championship. Their rider was Steve Hislop, a TT legend who knew how to hustle a motorcycle. And hustle he did. Norton won races, not just competed, won. Hislop took the RC588 to victory at Donington Park at Brands Hatch, at some of the most prestigious circuits in Britain. The following year, they went to the Isle of Man. The TT wasn't a world championship round anymore, but it still mattered. It was still the most demanding race in the world, 37 miles of public roads, stone walls, lamp posts, and an average speed that would make your eyes water. Norton hadn't won at the TT since 1961. Steve Hislop changed that. He rode the RCW588 to victory in the senior TT at an average speed of over 121 miles per hour. A rotary-powered Norton had won the TT. It was arguably the greatest moment in the company's modern history. But while Norton was celebrating, the regulatory storm clouds were gathering. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of story. Quick question: where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's where it gets complicated. Because Norton's success created a problem that nobody quite knew how to solve. See, motorcycle racing had always regulated engines by displacement. If you had a 500cc class, everyone ran 500cc engines. Simple. Fair. Everyone understood it. But displacement, in the traditional sense, refers to the volume swept by pistons moving in cylinders. A Wankel engine doesn't have pistons, it doesn't have cylinders. So what exactly is its displacement? The chambers in a rotary engine do have volume, you can measure them, but each rotor creates 3 combustion events per revolution, whereas a piston engine only creates 1 per 2 revolutions. So is a single rotor Wankel equivalent to a single cylinder 4-stroke or 3? Nobody could agree. The mathematical displacement of Norton's twin-rotor engine was 588 cc, hence the RCW588 designation. But if you calculated it differently, using the volume of the combustion chamber and accounting for the number of power strokes, you could argue it was equivalent to a much larger piston engine, maybe 900 cc, maybe more. And it wasn't just displacement. What about the power characteristics? A 750cc four-cylinder inline-four has very different behavior than a 750cc V-twin, but they're both regulated by displacement because historically there wasn't another way to do it. The Rotary threw all that out the window. The FIM, the Fédération Internationale de Motocyclisme, was the governing body for international motorcycle racing, and they were watching Norton's success with growing concern. Now, I should be clear here. The FIM wasn't necessarily acting in bad faith. They had a genuine regulatory puzzle on their hands, but they were also being pressured by Japanese manufacturers who had invested billions in traditional engine technology and didn't appreciate a British Rotary showing up and embarrassing their expensive piston-powered machines. Think about it from Honda's perspective, or Yamaha's, or Suzuki's. They'd spent decades perfecting the inline-four, they'd won championships, they'd built their brands on Grand Prix success, and now here comes Norton with an engine that works on completely different principles, claiming equivalency based on mathematical formulas that nobody had ever validated in competition. Was that fair? Honestly, it depends on who you ask. The FIM's first response was to create an equivalency formula. If you wanted to race a rotary engine, its displacement would be multiplied by a factor to create an equivalent four-stroke displacement. The idea was to level the playing field, to ensure the rotary didn't have an unfair advantage due to its unique power characteristics. Norton objected. They argued that any multiplier was arbitrary, designed to penalize their technology rather than create genuine equivalence. They weren't wrong. The multiplier that was eventually proposed, somewhere between 1.5 and 2, depending on the series, was essentially a guess. There was no scientific basis for it. Nobody had done the research to determine what factor would actually create competitive parity. The situation got worse. Different racing organizations applied different rules. The ACU, the Auto Cycle Union in Britain, had one interpretation. The FIM had another. American series had their own variations. Norton found themselves building multiple versions of their bike to comply with different regulations in different countries. And here's the really frustrating part. Even when Norton complied with the regulations, even when they accepted the displacement penalties, the rulemakers kept moving the goalposts. In some series, rotary engines were eventually banned outright. Not penalized, banned. The justification was usually something vague about maintaining the spirit of competition or protecting the traditional character of motorcycle racing. What that really meant was, we don't understand this technology, the Japanese manufacturers are complaining, and it's easier to prohibit it than to regulate it fairly. Norton fought back. They lobbied, argued, protested. They pointed out correctly that motorcycle racing had always been about innovation. The sport had evolved from single-speed belt drives to sophisticated multi-cylinder machines. Why should the rotary be treated differently? But they were fighting against the entire establishment. The Japanese manufacturers had money. They had political influence. They had decades of investment in traditional technology that would be devalued if rotaries became competitive. Norton had a revolutionary engine and a lot of passion. In the long run, that wasn't enough. The irony is that Norton's rotary was never actually proven to have an unfair advantage. Yes, they won races. Yes, Hislop took the TT, but they never dominated in a way that suggested the technology was unbeatable. Their wins came from good engineering, good riders, and good racecraft, the same ingredients that had always produced champions. If anything, the rotary had disadvantages that offset its strengths. The apex seal wear was still a problem. Fuel consumption was higher than equivalent piston engines, which meant either carrying more fuel or accepting shorter range. The gyroscopic effects of the rotor made the bike handle differently, requiring riders to adapt their technique. But none of that mattered. The perception was that the rotary was an alien technology that couldn't be fairly regulated, and in racing, perception often becomes reality. By the mid-1990s, Norton's rotary racing program was effectively dead. The company itself was struggling financially. That's a whole other story, involving collapsing parent companies, government intervention, and the general decline of the British motorcycle industry. But the racing ban was the final nail in the coffin for their grand experiment. They'd proven the technology worked. They'd won races, taken championships, conquered the TT, and they'd been shut out anyway. The story of Norton's Rotary is really a story about how established industries respond to disruptive technology. The Japanese manufacturers weren't wrong to be concerned. If the Rotary had been allowed to compete freely and had proven superior, it would have invalidated their entire development philosophy. Every factory race team was built around piston engine expertise. Every mechanic, every engineer, every piece of equipment was optimized for traditional engines. The Rotary threatened all of that. Not because it was necessarily better, that was never conclusively proven, but because it was different in ways that couldn't be easily accommodated by existing structures. And so the gatekeepers did what gatekeepers always do. They closed the gate. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying the FIM and other organizations were purely motivated by protectionism. The regulatory challenges were real. Creating fair competition between fundamentally different technologies is genuinely difficult. And there's a reasonable argument that racing should maintain some connection to production motorcycle technology, which was and is overwhelmingly piston-based. But the speed and totality of the Rotary ban still feels like an overreaction. Norton wasn't dominating. They were competitive. They were winning some races, losing others just like everyone else. The fair thing to do would have been to gather data over several seasons, analyze the results, and create evidence-based regulations. Instead, the regulators panicked. They saw something they didn't understand winning races, and they stopped it before it could win too many. What happened to the people involved in this story? Steve Hislop, the rider who gave Norton its greatest modern victories, continued racing after the Rotary program ended. He won 11 Isle of Man TT races across his career, making him one of the most successful TT riders in history. Tragically, he died in a helicopter accident in 2003. He was only 41 years old. The motorcycle racing world lost one of its genuine legends. Norton Motorcycles itself went through multiple owners, bankruptcies, and revivals over the following decades. The rotary technology was eventually shelved, though Norton briefly produced a road-going rotary in limited numbers. The current Norton company, now under new ownership, focuses on traditional piston-powered machines. The rotary dream is officially over. The Wankel engine itself survives in niche applications. Mazda kept the faith longer than anyone, producing rotary sports cars until 2012, and recently reviving the technology as a range extender in hybrid vehicles. Some aviation applications use rotaries, some drones. But the revolution that Felix Wankel envisioned, rotary engines replacing pistons across all applications, never materialized. And motorcycle racing? It continued to evolve, but within traditional parameters. Today's MotoGP bikes are technological marvels, but they're still piston-powered. The rotary remains a curiosity, a road not taken, a what-if that never got a fair chance to prove itself. There's a lesson here, I think, about innovation and established systems. Sometimes the best technology doesn't win. Sometimes the technology that fits best with existing infrastructure wins instead. The QWERTY keyboard isn't the most efficient layout, but it became standard, and now everything is built around it. VHS beat Betamax despite being arguably inferior. The internal combustion engine is probably less efficient than alternatives that never got developed because everyone was invested in gasoline. Norton's rotary was faster than some of its competitors. It was lighter. It was mechanically simpler. It might have pointed the way toward a different future for motorcycle design. But it required the entire racing establishment to adapt to something new, and that establishment decided it would rather not. The rotary ban wasn't a conspiracy. It was something more mundane, institutional conservatism dressed up in technical language. The FIM and other bodies didn't say, "We're protecting the Japanese manufacturers." They said, "We cannot fairly regulate this technology." But the effect was the same, and Norton? They went down swinging. They never accepted that their engine was unfair. They never accepted that the regulations were reasonable. They just kept racing until they weren't allowed to race anymore. There's something admirable about that, something very British in a way, the stubborn refusal to accept that the authorities might be right. Norton knew they'd built something special. They knew the Rotary worked. And they believed that if they could just keep competing, the results would speak for themselves. They were probably right, but they never got the chance to prove it. And that is the story of Norton's Wankel Rotary and the motorcycle that was too revolutionary to be allowed. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Was the ban justified, or did Norton get robbed? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.